The Cheyenne, a tribe belonging to the Algonquian linguistic stock, experienced profound transformations over the centuries as they migrated westward from their original homelands in the Great Lakes region of what is now Minnesota. In these earlier times, they lived in semi-sedentary villages along the Missouri River, constructing earth-covered log houses, farming maize and other crops, and crafting pottery. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence indicates that they engaged in trade networks linking them to other indigenous communities and early European traders. However, due to increasing competition over resources and conflict with neighboring nations often themselves displaced by European expansion, the Cheyenne gradually moved farther onto the Great Plains, where they found new opportunities and challenges. By the time they established themselves along the Missouri and Red Rivers, the Cheyenne had adapted to a more nomadic existence, focused on the great buffalo herds that roamed the prairies. This shift was part of a broader cultural transformation among many Plains tribes who had integrated the horse introduced to the continent centuries earlier by the Spanish and spread through intertribal trade into their economies, warfare, and social life. The Cheyenne became adept horsemen, skilled hunters, and formidable warriors. They forged strong alliances with the Arapaho and developed enduring ties, though often more fluid, with segments of the Sioux Lakota Confederacy. United by shared interests in defending their territories and preserving access to buffalo hunting grounds, these alliances shaped the politics and diplomacy of the Central and Northern Plains. Cheyenne governance rested on a carefully balanced system of authority that combined the spiritual and the secular. At its core was the Council of 44, an assembly of elder chiefs who oversaw communal decisions, mediated disputes, and maintained the moral and spiritual well-being of the people. Alongside this council, a set of military societies held sway. Each society had its own rights, symbols, dress, and responsibilities. These organizations included the Fox Warrior Society, the Elk Warrior Society, the Shield Warrior Society, the Bowstring Men or Bowstring Soldiers, and others. They enforced tribal laws, managed communal hunts, and provided leadership in times of war. Through their ceremonies and rituals, these societies embedded spiritual teachings and collective memory into their martial functions. Over time, one military society rose above the others in prestige, influence, and militancy: the Dog Soldiers, Hodamatanio and Cheyenne. Originally one of several esteemed groups, the Dog Soldiers gained prominence in the early 19th century. Around 1830, the men of the Massis Ononeno Band joined their ranks, greatly expanding the society's membership and political significance. As their numbers grew, so did their ability to shape tribal policy. By the mid-19th century, the Dog Soldiers had become the most powerful and militant of the Cheyenne warrior societies, representing a hardline faction that resisted making concessions to the United States or other external powers. The Dog Soldiers were not merely warriors, they were also stewards of community justice and order. They ensured that no single hunter exploited the buffalo before the entire camp could be provisioned, maintaining communal solidarity in the face of a resource critical for survival. They policed the camp during migrations, protected vulnerable individuals, and upheld social norms that prevented chaos and favoritism. In a cultural environment where reciprocity, fairness, and collective well-being were paramount, such a role commanded immense respect and influence. The mid-19th century brought intensified challenges as the United States expanded westward. Driven by notions of manifest destiny and economic ambition, settlers, miners, and ranchers poured into the plains. The discovery of gold in the Rocky Mountains during the 1850s accelerated this influx, while the establishment of military forts and posts secured transportation routes for emigrants heading to California, Oregon, or other frontier regions. Inevitably, this intrusion disrupted indigenous lifeways. Treaties such as the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie and the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise attempted to impose new boundaries. Often negotiated under duress, these treaties promised to respect certain territories, but rarely honored indigenous sovereignty fully. They reduced recognized native lands and set a precedent for further encroachments. While some Cheyenne leaders, facing an overwhelming onslaught of settlers and soldiers, contemplated reluctant compromise, the Dog Soldiers categorically opposed such treaties. They rejected the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise, which drastically reduced Cheyenne and Arapaho lands in Colorado, viewing it as a betrayal of previous agreements. Likewise, they were skeptical of treaties negotiated at the Little Arkansas River in 1865 and at Medicine Lodge in 1867, which aimed to resettle Southern Plains tribes onto reservations far from their original homelands. The Dog Soldiers considered these treaties instruments of dispossession that would confine them to areas without adequate buffalo or freedom. The eruption of violent conflict was perhaps inevitable. As the American Civil War drained federal manpower to the east, the plains became a contested frontier. Raids against wagon trains, stage stations, and isolated ranches by Cheyenne, Arapaho, and sometimes Sioux warriors increased. These actions aimed to deter further encroachment and force the U.S. government to negotiate on more equitable terms. The U.S. response, however, was often indiscriminate and brutal. One of the most infamous events was the Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864, when Colonel John M. Chivington and his Colorado volunteers attacked a Cheyenne and Arapaho village under Chief Black Kettle. Despite the presence of American and white flags signaling peace, about 150 Native people, mostly non-combatants, were killed. Survivors fled northward, many joining the Dog Soldiers, who had refused to negotiate any surrender. In the wake of Sand Creek, the Dog Soldiers and their allies launched retaliatory strikes, contributing to the Colorado War 1863 to 1865. They formed large war parties that included Lakota and Arapaho warriors, striking at military posts, wagon routes, and emigrant roads. Their campaigns challenged the perception that the plains could be easily tamed. Equally important, they represented a resurgence of indigenous unity, with multiple tribes aligning to resist U.S. expansion. Even before Sand Creek, the Dog Soldiers had demonstrated their influence. In 1840, for instance, the Cheyenne chiefs deferred to them the decision of whether peace should be made with the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache after disastrous intertribal clashes. By the late 1860s, their power in shaping external diplomacy and internal policy was indisputable. Nevertheless, the odds were stacked against them. The U.S. government responded by intensifying military campaigns, establishing new forts, and deploying more troops equipped with advanced firearms and artillery. During the late 1860s and early 1870s, officers like General Philip Sheridan and Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer spearheaded winter campaigns designed to strike native villages at their weakest moments. Destroying lodges, food caches, and horse herds, the U.S. Army aimed to force the tribes onto reservations. This relentless pressure, combined with the near extermination of the buffalo herds often encouraged by the U.S. government and private hunters, sapped the economic foundation of indigenous life. The Dog Soldiers fought valiantly against these constraints. They participated in numerous engagements, including lesser-known skirmishes and raids along the Platte and Smoky Hill rivers. Some warriors fought in broader campaigns, such as Red Cloud's War 1866 to 1868, when the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho successfully closed the Bozeman Trail to Montana's gold fields, forcing the U.S. to reconsider its policies. Although not all Dog Soldiers were directly involved, their ethos and influence rippled through allied tribes, reinforcing a legacy of resistance. The Beecher's Island Fight of 1868 along the Arikari River, where Cheyenne and other native forces laid siege to a group of well-armed frontier scouts, demonstrated both their tenacity and the changing nature of warfare. While the outnumbered scouts survived by entrenching themselves and using long-range rifles to hold off attacking warriors, the prolonged battle underscored the complexity and lethality of the conflicts. Roman Nose, a renowned Cheyenne warrior, though not necessarily a Dog Soldier by strict definition, he was associated with other warrior societies, played a significant role in these fights. becoming a symbol of bravery and tactical skill before his death during the Beecher's Island engagement. As the 1870s progressed, the U.S. government tightened its grip on the plains. The Medicine Lodge Treaty 1867 and the subsequent relocation of many southern plains tribes to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, forced some Cheyenne and Arapaho into unfamiliar environments where farmland was poor and rations were insufficient. Disease, hunger, and despair spread in the reservations. Meanwhile, northern Cheyenne bands that had allied with the Lakota continued to struggle for autonomy in Montana and Wyoming. The 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, in which a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and a few Arapaho warriors annihilated Custer's 7th Cavalry, temporarily bolstered indigenous morale. Yet the U.S. response was swift and overwhelming, prompting intensified military campaigns that would, by the end of the decade, confine nearly all northern plains tribes to reservations. During this time, some Dog soldiers and their allies refused to abandon their quest for freedom. Leaders like Dull Knife and Little Wolf guided breakaway groups of northern Cheyenne northward from Indian Territory in 1878, attempting to return to their original homelands. They clashed with settlers, volunteers, and soldiers along the way. Lieutenant Colonel William H. Lewis's death was one notable consequence of these encounters. When Dull Knife's band approached Fort Robinson, Nebraska, they were imprisoned and ordered to return south. Refusing what they viewed as certain death in the reservations, they endured starvation for days and eventually attempted a desperate breakout in January 1879. Many were killed, including prominent Dog soldier leaders like Tangle Hare. Yet this tragic event became a hallmark of Cheyenne perseverance, symbolizing an unbreakable spirit that refused to accept injustice and confinement. By the early 1880s, sustained military pressure, environmental destruction, and political maneuvering had effectively broken the cycle of overt resistance. The Cheyenne, along with the Arapaho and other tribes, found themselves confined to reservations where they faced a new set of challenges. Forced assimilation policies, administered by government agents and reinforced by Christian missionary schools, aimed to erode indigenous languages, spiritual traditions, and social structures. Children were sent to distant boarding schools, where many suffered cultural dislocation and abuse. Tribal governance was undermined by U.S. authorities who imposed their own systems of law and administration. Despite these hardships, many Cheyenne retained vital aspects of their cultural identity. Spiritual ceremonies, including the sun dance which, although temporarily suppressed by U.S. authorities, survived underground, language teaching, and the preservation of oral history ensured the endurance of Cheyenne traditions. While the Dog Soldier Society never regained the power and martial relevance it held at mid-century, its legacy persisted in collective memory. Descendants spoke of the courage, discipline, and principles of fairness that once guided these warrior enforcers. They recalled how the Dog soldiers had staked their sashes to the ground in battle, vowing not to retreat even in the face of overwhelming odds, an act symbolizing ultimate dedication to the survival and honor of their people. By the dawn of the 20th century, the old world of the free-roaming buffalo hunters was gone. Yet many Cheyenne adapted creatively to reservation life, finding ways to navigate the forced changes. They took up ranching, farmed what arable land was available, and participated in wage labor or the Indian service, all while striving to maintain cultural continuity. The legacy of the Dog soldiers served as a touchstone reminder that their ancestors once defended their autonomy with courage and strategic skill. This legacy also informed pan-Indian movements in the 20th century, as Native communities organized politically to demand federal policy reforms, citizenship rights, and the protection of their treaties, lands, and resources. Today, the memory of the Dog soldiers is sustained by historians, tribal elders, and community members. Scholars have examined period documents, military records, and oral histories to better understand the complexities of Cheyenne resistance. Museums and cultural centers exhibit artifacts and recount stories of these warrior societies, providing education to younger generations. Among contemporary Cheyenne cultural revitalization efforts include the revival of traditional arts, dances, ceremonies, and language instruction. While the Dog Soldiers as an institution do not exist in the form they once did, their spirit of resilience, justice, and communal responsibility continues to inspire. In addition, the broader American public has gradually come to acknowledge the injustices that indigenous nations faced. Landmark events like the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act 1978 and the establishment of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., have created platforms to share indigenous perspectives. The recognition of historical events, such as Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site in Colorado, serves as a memorial and a site of remembrance, underscoring the need for honesty and reconciliation in the telling of American history. In this larger narrative, the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers stand out as more than just a group of fierce warriors. They represent the very heart of a struggle for sovereignty and cultural survival in the face of extraordinary upheaval. Their story reveals the complexity of Plains warfare, where spiritual beliefs, environmental stewardship, and social ethics guided the actions of those who fought. They highlight the moral dilemmas and profound sacrifices indigenous communities made, choosing resistance over surrender and cultural dignity over expedient compromise. While the balance of power ultimately favored the United States, which possessed industrial resources, political unity, and massive numbers of settlers flooding the West, the Dog Soldiers left an indelible imprint on the historical landscape. They forced the United States to confront the reality that Native nations were not simply obstacles to be brushed aside, but living polities with their own laws, leaders, and visions of the future. Though the final outcome saw the Cheyenne confined to reservations, the memory of Dog Soldiers continues to guide reflections on resistance, resilience, and the capacity of a people to endure, adapt, and remember. In sum, the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers were more than just a powerful military society. They were custodians of an ideal. They exemplified collective responsibility, spiritual depth, courageous defiance, and a profound commitment to their homeland and cultural identity. Their legacy endures as a compelling chapter in the broader saga of indigenous North America, reminding us that the Plains were once alive with nations who spoke languages of their own making, hunted according to time-honored rhythms, and governed themselves through councils and warrior societies that embodied the highest ideals of communal life.